Republicans dead. Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay?
The women with the least likelihood of getting pregnant are the ones most worried about having abortions.
On January 6th of 2021, you had tens of thousands of people peacefully protesting.
No, it's not a right-wing conspiracy theory. It's not QAnon. It's real.
Hey folks, welcome back to the Enemies List podcast. I am your host today, Rick Wilson, as always. And today I am joined by Jim Wallis. Jim is a person who is deeply involved in a faith journey that doesn't look like a lot of the faith journeys you might consider happen in this country. A lot of people associate now faith with the right. And I think that's been a mistake. It's always been a mistake. But Jim is a man of the left who has thought deeply about Christian nationalism and how we reclaim Christianity from the Republican Party, and how we address the threat that Christian nationalism poses to an American democracy and then the American Republic. So with that, Jim, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show today. Jim, your new book is The False White Gospel. Talk to us about the origin story of this book, and then I want to branch out into your knowledge of the risks of Christian nationalism to America.
Sure. Well, I'm glad to be here. I often say, don't go right, don't go left, go deeper. And that's what this book tries to do. False white gospel. Well, let's talk about white Christian nationalism. That's what this is really aimed at. And the name spells the problem. You take the most welcoming, inclusive, inviting message in the world, the gospel of Jesus, and you make it white. And then if they say Christian, but they don't mean service and sacrifice, they mean control, domination. And a lot of theologians know this goes back to something called dominionist theology, way back even before our founding, that white Europeans had the right to the land and could displace and even almost destroy indigenous culture and enslave a whole African population with papal bulls and Puritan preaching all behind it. And then nationalist. Student asked me last night if it's a difference between patriotism and nationalism. I said, yes, there is. You can love your country, as we all do, and for all kinds of reasons. But nationalist puts one nation above the others, and it's an against, your nation against. And that biblically, to put your nation first and worship your nation, is called idolatry. Strong word,
Right.
but that's what it really is. So what I try and do is I take, chapter 1 is about this false white gospel, but then the book is really 6 iconic biblical passages that I've tried to reframe and refresh to help bring us back to something different.
So as we look at the emergence of Christian nationalism in its current form, it is very much centered around Donald Trump, but it's been a presence on our political stage for a lot longer than Trump has. Talk to us about how from the 80s to today, we've seen this emergence of an increasingly assertive Christian nationalist movement in America.
Well, you're right. It's old. It's making a comeback under Donald Trump. He didn't invent it, but he's appealing to it. He's really stoking people's fear, which leads to hate, which leads to violence. And so I talk about how this has been, what I call America's original sin, are not just slavery, but the kind of racial hierarchy that we created in American and British slavery, and how repentance from sin doesn't mean just feeling guilty or sorry or blaming or pointing your finger. It means the word repentance in Jewish, Islamic, Christian teaching means turning around, going in a whole different direction.
Right.
And so that's what this book tries to do, turn around, taking these critical texts that can, I think, bring us back to its subtitles: rejecting Christian nationalism, reclaiming true faith, and refounding democracy. All three, I think, are necessary.
So when we talk about refounding democracy in this country, talk to me about your feelings on that, because I think that is I think we have had a perilous relationship in the last few years with democracy. There's been a large fraction of the American public who have been very, very interested in um, in a post-democratic world, a post uh, a post-republic world. Talk to us about refounding democracy. What are your thinkings and findings on that in the course of this book?
Yeah, well, it's not the first time that there have been strong men who want a kind of autocratic leadership and appeal to religion, appeal to religious segments to offer them that. So we have a history of this, but it's coming back. It's coming back because I think we are closer to a multiracial democracy than we've
Sure.
ever been in our history.
Mm-hmm.
And if we achieve that, we'll be the first nation in the world to have a genuinely multiracial democracy. And so that's why they're pushing back. That's why they're fighting so hard. That's why they're threatening with, by any means necessary, to in
Right.
fact install uh, autocratic rule, white minority rule. By 2040 or 50, we'll no longer be a white majority nation. We'll be a majority of minorities. And that's
Correct.
frightening to certain people in this kind of country. Instead of seeing our diversity as the nation's great gift, they see it as a terrible threat. So
Mm-hmm.
Donald Trump talks openly about making the Justice Department into his personal law firm to attack his enemies and jail his opponents, about suspending freedom of the press, about being dictatorship on day one, and I doubt
Mm-hmm.
it will end on day one. So he's really being very clear. And you've got people like Liz Cheney, who's a conservative Republican, who's
Sure.
supporting Kamala Harris because of democracy, because of the
Right.
Constitution, which he actually says he'll terminate. So he's been very clear about what he's going to do, and we have to be very clear about what we're going to do to try and stop that from happening.
Tell me about some of the steps you think we need to be taking as a country right now to prevent that decline of democracy and that imposition of Christian nationalism.
Well, I've been in all these battleground states:
Mm-hmm.
North Carolina, Arizona, uh, Michigan, Wisconsin. I'm going back there twice to Ohio coming up. And I remember in North Carolina, I said, "You're in play. You're in play." The media says, "You're in play." And they all smile. "We're in play." I said, "Is faith in play in North Carolina or Arizona?" Uh, and I think there's going to be a faith factor in this election that could be decisive. So, is it going to be white Christian nationalism that's the faith factor? Or people, what I call for is returning to the teachings of Jesus. Christians or others, these ancient texts are really decisive. For
Mm-hmm.
example, we had a training last night. We're training poll chaplains. Poll chaplains. I call them
Okay.
lawyers and collars. And these are clergy who are being trained to be in perilous polling places where voter
Sure.
suppression and intimidation is being threatened. And my job is always to set the moral framework, it's called, for these training calls. We trained almost 2,000 poll chaplains so far. And I always go back to the first chapter of the first book of the Bible. Um, and I mentioned all the noise. You know, Rick, you're surrounded by noise, political noise.
Always.
We all
Always.
are. And your job and my job is to try to bring perspective to that. Yet I get weary sometimes of all the noise, you know. So when I get weary of all the noise, I go to that first chapter, the first book of the Bible, Genesis 1:26, and it
Hmm.
says, imagine the noise all around. It says, then God said, almost like, be quiet, noise.
Hmm.
Then God said, and what God says then is, let us create humankind, it means all of us, after
Right.
our own image, in our own image, and after our own likeness. That right there, beginning of the scriptures, is the divine foundation for our dignity, for all of us, uh, for human rights, for civil rights, for voting rights. And so, literally, this is, Rick, this is theological for me. Any attempt to
Right.
suppress a vote, or deny a vote,
Sure.
or corrupt a vote, or intimidate a vote because of somebody's skin color or any reason is literally an assault on Imago Dei, assault on the image of God.
Sure.
And so we've taken that to secretaries of state. You know that text? I said, yeah. That means that every voter in your state is made in the image of God, right? I say,
Hmm.
yeah, never thought about that. Okay, well, that means the processes, the procedures, the practices, the access to voting is really opening up people's precious voice and precious vote, as John Lewis would say, uh, to the image of God. And so, to me, this is very deeply theological and spiritual, and not just political.
We've seen a lot of distortions of biblical teachings, a lot of distortions of biblical intent with things like the prosperity gospel and these these this faction of the evangelical movement that are increasingly about political outcomes, not faith outcomes, not spiritual outcomes. They're about achieving political and policy outcomes that they are most interested in. Is there a path in your mind as we hopefully, I think, as we pass this era of Trump, to help some of those people go come back into a frame where their faith isn't
Yeah.
about their politics and vice versa?
Yeah, well put. To me, I do a podcast called The Soul of the Nation. And
Hmm.
every time I say, our faith is supposed to shape our politics and not
Right.
the other way around. And now we're seeing the other way around. So I just did a column and was on Morning Joe actually this week about this new movement called the New Apostolic Reformation. They're having
Okay.
these courage tours all around the country. And the Atlantic is a wonderful piece, October 1st, about a reporter from the Atlantic who went to one in Eau Claire, Wisconsin.
Hmm.
And I listened to this, and their favorite word in this rally was warrior, warrior.
Right.
And they say, you should be God's appointed warriors to do whatever the Almighty requires in this election and beyond. And this evangelist on the stage, I had to write this down to make sure I had it right. He said, we must prepare for war. He said, I'm not here on this earth to be blessed. I'm here to be armed and dangerous. That's what he said. Then he called for the crowd to chant warrior back to him. So, you know the text, blessed are the armed and dangerous, for they should be called the children of God. No, I got that wrong.
I missed
Blessed
that
are
one.
the peacemakers, for they should be called the children of God. So we're having
It's been
called
a
the
minute since
warriors.
divinity class, but I missed that one.
So, you know, I was asked. I'm asked all the time, how do they do this? How do they? Eugene Robinson of the Washington Post asked me
Mhm.
this week. He said, "How don't they read these texts? These evangelists, these preachers, don't they know these texts? How do they ignore these texts? How do they ignore them?" And I said, the answer is power. They want
Mhm.
power. They want to use religion and their version of it to gain power with Donald Trump. This is about power. And, Jesus called us not to seek the power of this world, but to bring a different way of living into it, into the world.
Right.
And I recalled in this conversation how one of the earliest temptations of Jesus was Satan himself took him to a high mountain,
To a high spot. Yep.
showed him the world, and says, "You can rule all of this.
Mm-hmm.
You can be in charge of all of this if you just bow down and worship me. And if you bow down and worship me." So Jesus says, get thee behind me, Satan. Get thee behind me, Satan."
Mm-hmm.
So when there are these religious power brokers calling on their followers to ignore the teachings of Jesus and seek power by any means necessary, the response back should be, as Jesus said, "Get thee behind me, Satan," because that's what we're talking about.
This idea of having a church militant instead of the church triumphant, or the church penitent in these, to mix a few different strains here. The idea of having a church militant, I think, I think there's an appeal to that when they think that they are not living for a for a religious future, but a political future. And I still can't quite put my finger on where that desire to achieve the political end over the spiritual end has infected particularly evangelical. I mean, there are some Catholic folks that are in that same
Yeah.
category, but I think it's most prominent in the evangelical movement. I still don't understand. Like, was there a moment that you could put your finger on where it sort of switched from into that sort of church militant mode?
Well, in the book, I talk about some of that history.
Mhm.
And I grew up in the evangelical world. And
Right.
when I got involved in the civil rights movement and opposed the war in Vietnam and
Hmm.
began the fight against poverty, they made it clear I wasn't welcome anymore. So I became pretty secular in my student activist days.
Hmm.
But I came back to my faith after organizing at Michigan State, and we shut the place down and turned thousands to march and even to Washington. And even though my church had left me or I had left it, I could never quite get shed of Jesus, probably because I was raised that
Sure.
way. And so I began on my own to read the New Testament again,
Hmm.
go back to it. And I found this text, which became my conversion text, Matthew 25, 25th chapter of Matthew.
Sure.
I call it the "It Was Me" text. Jesus says, "I was hungry. I was thirsty. I was naked. I was a stranger. I was sick. I was in prison. And as you served or welcomed these poor and vulnerable people, you welcomed me." It was me. That was the most radical thing I'd ever read, more than Che Guevara, Karl Marx, and Ho Chi Minh. And so I signed up, and that text stays with me today. It's a good text. It converts you over and over again. And so when we go back to that text, I'm in Oklahoma City right now. I spoke yesterday, Oklahoma City University, and we went through that text again. We went back to that text, and particularly this when he says "welcome the stranger," the word there for stranger in the Matthew 25 text means immigrant.
Right.
That's what it means. It's refugee immigrant.
Hmm.
And so Springfield, Ohio, to me, is a Matthew 25 moment where you have a presidential candidate who lied in a presidential debate and said Haitian immigrants are stealing and eating people's beloved cats and dogs.
Hmm.
Now, the Republican governor of Ohio said that's not true. They're contributing, they're helping revitalize the economy of
Sure.
Springfield. The mayor said that's not true. It was Republican also. But they keep on lying about this. And you look at who Donald Trump lies most about, again and again, it's about immigrants
Right.
of color, non-white immigrants, and they're rapists and criminals and all from insane asylums and prisons, and they're dangerous and they're killers and murderers. They're taking our housing away. Lies again and again and again. And what's happening here is Jesus says, welcome the stranger. And Trump
Right.
instead wants to demean, to demonize, and now massively deport millions of immigrants, which he's promising to do. Immigration, to fix this broken system comprehensively, it's going to be complicated. It's tough.
Sure.
We'll need Republicans and Democrats. But to demonize the stranger is totally contrary, antithetical to the spirit of Jesus Christ. So last night, we just went through all that, and you've got to go back to the text. What did Jesus say? What did he do? And what does it mean for us?
As you're going around the country training these folks to be pastors at the polls, essentially, and to share a different version of the gospel with people, what is the future that you hope for, Jim? In this, what does the world look like where you've succeeded in your mission in terms of our politics and our culture and our country?
Yeah. Well, this history question that you raised a moment ago, let me say a little more about that.
Sure.
So I read this text, went to seminary, and from 1970 to 1980, we were young evangelicals, and we were trying to change evangelicalism by adding social justice to personal salvation, and it was succeeding. We had established evangelical leaders signing with us the Chicago Declaration of Evangelical Concern. But by 1980, we had political operatives literally taking over the evangelical world. And one of them was Richard Viguerie. And I know
yes.
Richard, we talked about stuff. And Richard literally said to me, he bragged, he said, so we just reached out to Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson. And Richard Viguerie was the big direct mail guy, the direct mail group.
Yep.
And he says, give us your lists. Give us your lists, and we'll make you household words in America. Make your names household words. That's what he told me they said to Falwell and Robertson. So that's how we got the moral majority, created by Republican operatives. So it wasn't just a theological shift. It was a political takeover of my evangelical tradition. So I want to go back to what Jesus said in his opening gig, his mission statement. I call it his Nazareth Manifesto. He quoted Isaiah, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. Now, the word there for good news is evangel, from which we get evangelicalism, evangelism. But that text suggests to me that any gospel that isn't good news to the poor, whatever else it isn't the gospel of Jesus Christ, period. So what do I want to see? I want to see Christians. I want the word, white evangelical or white Christian. I want the word evangelical or Christian to define and transform the word white. Instead, it's the other way around. White dominates the phrase. That's our problem. So we have to be set free from this idol of whiteness, which we don't even often feel, or white people don't understand. It's just assumed. And so this is where I think we need to go to set us free from our idolatry of white Christianity. That's where we need to go. And I see a new generation, even younger evangelicals, want to break from that white Christian nationalism, and they want a gospel that's truer to the word of Jesus.
Well, it's a fascinating question, Jim, and I thank you for the work that you're doing out there in the country, folks. The book is "The False White Gospel" by Jim Wallis. It is a compelling look at some alternatives to the evangelical politicization of faith in this country. Thank you, Jim, for coming on the show today. We appreciate your time. We look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thank you. It's great to be. This is a great conversation you have on your show.
Thank you.
I'm
Thank you.
blessed to be part of it.
Well, I appreciate you. I appreciate you. All right.
Thanks a lot.
There are a lot of Republicans in the great state of Florida who voted against FEMA aid just recently, just the other day. They said, oh no, this is part of deep state, big libtard government. We're not voting for FEMA aid. It's going to be used for whatever they thought it was going to be used for. But you know what's great? You know what's amazing is the minute Hurricane Milton hits, these fuckers are front and center. Oh God, rush the FEMA aid to St. Pete and Clearwater, including a woman named Anna Paulina Luna. She's a member of Congress. Think of her as a Marjorie Taylor Greene or a Lauren Boebert without the intelligence, dignity, probity, and wisdom. She is an influencer who wants to be, I don't even know. Before the hurricane hit, she was off campaigning for Donald Trump in North Carolina. Went to D.C., voted against FEMA aid, and now that a major hurricane has hit the Tampa area, she's screaming for FEMA aid. You know what? I don't want to punish any community that gets hit by denying them FEMA aid. But if you're a leader in Congress and you're in a state like Florida, and as almost every Republican has voted against FEMA aid from the state of Florida, you are gambling a lot, people, with the lives of folks in your state. It is a repulsive position. So this week, Anna Paulina Luna, you are on the enemies list.